It didn't always feel like loneliness. That's the part that makes it hardest to explain. You weren't necessarily alone in rooms. There were people around. Noise, movement, activity. But there was a different absence. A quieter one. The kind you feel when something inside you reaches outward and finds nothing returning. You learned early how to keep yourself company. Not as a skill, but as a necessity. You noticed that certain feelings didn't have anywhere to land. That questions could sit unanswered for long stretches of time. That being understood wasn't something you could depend on. So you stopped waiting for it. You don't remember making that choice. You remember adapting. You became observant, careful, internally busy. While other kids moved outward, you moved inward. You learned how to think things through alone. How to calm yourself without reassurance. How to sit with confusion without asking for help. People often describe you as independent. They don't realize how early that independence began. There's a specific sensation that comes from growing up emotionally alone. It isn't dramatic. It's subtle. A constant sense that you're slightly out of sync with the world around you. That you're present but not fully accompanied. You learn to read between words. To sense moods without them being named. To understand situations without explanation. That awareness became second nature. Even now, you notice things before others do. Shifts in tone. Changes in energy. The moment someone pulls back before they admit it. You don't react outwardly. You store it. You've always been good at storing things. Feelings without witnesses. Thoughts that didn't feel welcome. Questions that seemed inconvenient. You learned to keep them inside until they made sense. Sometimes they never did. You grew up faster in certain ways. Not because you had to take care of others, but because you had to take care of yourself emotionally. You didn't expect comfort to arrive, so you became comfortable without it. That comfort came with a cost. You became self-contained. You don't naturally assume others will understand you. You don't expect support by default. You don't instinctively reach outward when something feels heavy. Reaching feels uncertain, so instead, you think. You analyze. You reflect. You replay conversations long after they end. Not because you enjoy it, but because your inner world learned to do the work that wasn't being done elsewhere. You're often told you're thoughtful, deep, insightful. They don't see how that depth formed. They don't see how often you learned to process emotion alone. How early you became your own witness. You became skilled at understanding others. You had to. Understanding was how you stayed connected without being fully seen. You learned how to listen without interrupting. How to empathize without being asked. How to be present without demanding presence in return. People feel safe with you. They open up. They confide. They relax. You hold space naturally. But when it's your turn, something shifts. You don't know how to step into the center without discomfort. You don't know how to be emotionally messy in front of someone else. You don't trust that your inner world will be handled gently. So you keep it tidy. You share selectively. You edit yourself. You stay composed. Not because you're closed, but because you learned that exposure doesn't always lead to connection. You've noticed how often you feel closer to people in your head than you do in real time. You understand them deeply, but they only see parts of you. That imbalance feels familiar. It feels like childhood, being present without being fully met. You don't resent it. You normalize it. You tell yourself you're just private, just introspective, just someone who doesn't need much. But sometimes late at night, a different feeling surfaces, a quiet ache. Not for attention, for resonance. For the sense that your inner experience exists in someone else's awareness. You've learned to live without that. But living without something doesn't mean you don't feel its absence. It means you adapted to it. And those adaptations didn't disappear when you grew up. They became the way you think, the way you approach relationships, the way you make decisions, the way you process pain. You don't expect others to fill emotional gaps. You fill them yourself. That self-sufficiency looks like strength, and it is, but it's also a clue. Because people who never felt emotionally alone don't think this way. They don't monitor connection. They don't brace for misunderstanding. They don't assume silence means disinterest. You do. Automatically. Not because you're pessimistic, because you learned what happens when you hope too openly. So you hope quietly. You stay observant. You stay measured. You stay slightly detached. And that detachment isn't what others think it is. It isn't indifference. It's familiarity. It's the echo of having learned very early how to be with yourself when no one else showed up. That realization hasn't fully landed yet. For now, it lingers. In the way you think before you speak. In the way you hesitate before you trust. In the way you've built an entire inner world that doesn't require an audience. And beneath all of that, a question waits. What kind of thinking develops in a child who learns how to be emotionally alone before they learn how to be emotionally held? As you grow older, that early emotional self-reliance doesn't disappear. It organizes itself. You begin to notice that your mind moves differently. Slower in expression, faster in recognition. You don't rush toward closeness. You don't assume availability. You don't expect emotional presence to be consistent. Instead, you prepare for gaps. When connection feels warm, part of you stays alert. When someone listens closely, you wonder how long it will last. When care appears, you appreciate it quietly, but you don't lean into it fully. This isn't fear. It's calibration. You learned early how to adjust expectations before disappointment arrived. This is where the midpoint shifts. What others interpret as emotional distance isn't distance at all. What feels like withdrawal isn't a lack of desire. What looks like coldness is caution refined over time. You don't avoid connection. You approach it with measured depth. Your thinking reflects this. You don't assume people will meet you where you are. You check first. You observe. You wait. You've become skilled at reading what's available without asking directly. You watch consistency instead of words. You notice effort instead of promises. You trust patterns more than reassurance. That way of thinking didn't come from pessimism. It came from experience. From learning that emotional presence can vanish without warning. From realizing that needing too much too openly can leave you exposed. From understanding that closeness doesn't always mean safety. So you became internally anchored. You learned how to sit with feelings without external validation. How to think things through alone. How to carry complexity without sharing it immediately. That inner containment looks like detachment to those who rely on constant emotional exchange. But detachment isn't what you feel. You feel depth. Just privately. This is the psychological truth of the final stretch. Empaths who felt emotionally alone as children often develop a relational mindset rooted in self-witnessing rather than co-regulation. They become their own mirror. They don't wait to be understood before understanding themselves. They don't require immediate reflection to remain stable. They don't collapse when emotional presence fades. They adjust. This makes them resilient. But it also makes connection complicated. You don't assume someone will hold your inner world with care. You don't relax into interdependence. You don't hand over your emotional center easily. Not because you don't want closeness, but because closeness once arrived inconsistently. So your mind learned to stay one step ahead. You think in contingencies, in emotional backups, in internal support systems. You always know how you'll handle things if no one shows up. That preparedness feels like maturity, but it also carries a quiet grief. The grief of never fully trusting that someone else will stay present when things get heavy. The grief of being skilled at solitude when you didn't choose it. The grief of realizing how much you've carried alone. You don't dramatize this. You don't even name it often. You simply notice that intimacy feels easier in thought than in practice. That being understood feels safer internally than externally. That you often retreat into reflection instead of reaching outward. You've built a rich inner life. It keeps you steady. It keeps you thoughtful. It keeps you functioning, but it also keeps you slightly separate. You're rarely surprised by disappointment. Rarely caught off guard by withdrawal. Rarely shattered by loss. Because your system was trained not to rely too heavily on anyone else's presence. That training worked. But it also shaped how you think about closeness. You don't assume it. You don't chase it. You don't depend on it. You allow it carefully. And when it fades, you don't panic. You return to yourself. That return is familiar. Comfortable, even. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, a different awareness surfaces. Not urgency, curiosity. You begin to wonder what it would feel like not to anticipate emotional absence. Not to prepare for being unseen. Not to keep one foot anchored in self-containment at all times. That question doesn't ask for change. It asks for honesty. Because the way you think didn't form randomly. It formed around a truth you learned early. Emotional presence wasn't guaranteed. And now, as an adult, that truth still shapes how you move toward others and how much of yourself you allow them to see. You don't need to resolve this tonight. This isn't about fixing anything. It's about recognizing the architecture of your inner world, how it was built to survive emotional solitude, how it still protects you, and how it quietly influences every connection you make. Sit with that, not to undo it, just to notice how much of your thinking was shaped by learning how to be emotionally alone long before you ever had words for it.